Welcome to the Chess Channel, the channel where you can learn loads. Today, we have another smashing encounter between two of the biggest names in the history of the game. One is Garry Kasparov, and two is Mikhail Tal. This specific game came from an encounter the two had, in which 12 games were played. This one dates back to 1978, and was game 2 of 12. Anyone who is familiar with this game needs no reminder of what happened. In case you have missed it, sit back and enjoy the ride. Just for those who might require a bit more detail than what we provided, this was a friendly blitz tournament and was played in the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, between the two legends. We know this was game 2 of 12, so let's get this one underway. Kasparov this side opted for on e4, and Tal responded with the Sicilian. Just a word on the Sicilian, and we shall try and be as brief as we can. Did you know, from the 12 games played, 4 went into the Sicilian? Knight f3 led to this knight to be developed. Kasparov here goes for the center, and with these two pawns coming of, Tal opts for this knight development. Knight c3 to cover the central pawn, and mind you, you may want to check the previous game we covered between Bobby Fischer and Mikhail Tal. I will try and get the link as soon as possible, so do keep an eye out for it, on the top right hand side of your screen. Tal normally opts for a typical e6, but not in this game. He followed the Rautzer variation, but Kasparov himself is also quite familiar with this line. Bishop g5, creating in a way some sort of pressure, now led to this push to the 6th, and before we forget, the Rautzer or Richter Rautzer comes into play as soon as this bishop finds this outpost on g5. Without a shadow of a doubt, all the moves we just witnessed were played in seconds, but let's wait and see at what point the game will deviate. Queen d2 resulted to this infamous push to a6, Kasparov here castles, and with bishop d7, why not? A straight f4, a move that is so popular in the Sicilian. f4 resulted to this push on the queen side. Kasparov here hands over the bishop for the knight, and because taking with the queen is simply not going to work, Tal is fully aware of this and takes, using the pawn. So what would be the problem if you take with the queen? It's because of this attack on the queen. If you take, can you see how to make progress? It's here with this takes on the queen side. Should you get greedy and get this knight out of his misery, what you are looking at is a straight mate in just one, and we are going to skip the last move. Coming back by one move, if you let the knight be, the only move you have, would be to retreat the queen. If you place her here on e7, the knight fork on c7 is going to hurt. And if you back off the queen all the way back to where she came from, this incoming check is most likely going to force off these two minor pieces, and even if this pawn on f4 now departs, what you are looking to achieve is this knight jump right into the center of the board. Queen e7 to try and get the queens to go, and by no means Kasparov would need to accept. Back off to the second, and everything looks more than fine for this side. This was one variation we could have skipped, but it was necessary to show to convince anyone who needed persuasion. With the double pawns on the f-file, Kasparov decided to trade the knights, and though there was no visible need to do what Kasparov did, this was the move he went for. Bishop e7, getting ready to get the king to safety, resulted to this bishop repositioning. Tal could have chased after the knight on c3, but he comes up with something that looked stronger, but was it really? That supposedly stronger move was this queen response, allowing now Tal the opportunity to choose which side to castle. King b1, got Tal to castle long, rook f1 follows, and now via this response, Kasparov goes for it via this move. King b8 as opposed to taking, resulted to this queen move, and we believe, both players are out of prep by now. Queen c5, resulted to Kasparov to take in the center, and with now Tal capturing, has this not solved his double pawn structure? Knight e2, resulted to a rather strange reaction by Tal. He knows the more pieces coming off, the better it could be for him, and especially when he has the black pieces. The pressure appears now to be on e6, but is Kasparov going to allocate resources to try and get to him? Tal saw exactly what was on its way and tried to swap the queens by challenging the queen in this way. Knight f4, avoiding the trade momentarily, resulted to this rook repositioning. Here Kasparov blocks the access to e4 in this way, and with finally Tal creating his first real threat on the queen, this queen had to go somewhere. That somewhere was here. Though e6 is now weak, this pawn on g2 is additionally weakened. Bishop c8 to block any ideas of removing the pawn on e6, and though Tal seems to have everything covered, Kasparov finds a real useful resource. He tried this queen response to try and get right to the opposing king. Bishop d8, king c7, and queen c5 all look like viable options to stop the queen's access into b6. Tal knew a king move would not have been a strong response, so, having given it some thought and within the time limits he had, this is how he tried to resolve the problem. Queen e2 resulted to this rook lift, c3 is played here, and with now the rook swinging. Why did Tal place the rook here? We do need to remember this was a blitz game and you would expect the most unexpected moves. Was this rook move into e5 one of them? Bishop c2, to try and get this bishop to find a much better spot on the board, resulted to yet another Tal attempt to get the queens to depart. Knight d3, attacking now the rook, forced in a way the rook to move to this square. Here Kasparov finds the opportune moment to chase after the queen, and with now Tal backing off, Kasparov opts for this knight jump. What he is clearly after, is this pawn, right in the center of the board. Rook back to where he stood previously, led to this queen repositioning to protect e4, and what does Tal do? He went about it by picking up his queen and placing her here just in case there is threat generated on the knight. This very move got now the bishop to move out of c8, but by placing him not on d7 but instead here on the diagonal, had the great Tal committed to an unforgivable blunder. Kasparov did spot a problem with this move and feared that with the bishop now in control of all the white squares on the diagonal he is on, was there a threat that his queen could be trapped? Also, could Kasparov go for the removal of this pawn on e6, and if so, how could he take? He can actually take with either minor piece, but slightly better would be to take with the bishop. Bishop d8 and something like this attack on the bishop, and even if you try and get the rook to come into the game via this move, this queen repositioning would be the icing on the cake. If you take and capture with the knight, queen c6, and this brand new attack on the queen, and Kasparov's position is unrivaled. Coming back to this position, Kasparov either missed it or did not think getting rid of the pawn on e6 was the right time, and therefore, given we assume he was worried about the position of his queen relative to that of this king, this was how he decided to do things. Kasparov knows the king in the very corner is not the ideal spot to place him, especially when he has no escape capabilities. At least for now, with the two rooks on the first, there is no danger of the king getting trapped or checkmated. The magician from Riga went for it. He advanced this pawn, Kasparov in turn removes this pawn, Tal does the same, and with Kasparov not seeing any advantages of getting his knight to jump into e6, he instead chose to chase after the rook. Tal had the option to trade the rooks, but for some reason he opted for something else. What did he do? He got this sort of attack going, but how strong or weak was it? Kasparov did not like the looks of this bishop and decided to put an end to this bishop's journey. He chose to go for the exchange, and the reason for it was to be able to attack the rook in this way. If you look carefully enough, this rook is now a goner, but was there any other way Kasparov could have played it? I beg your pardon, the rook is not trapped because Tal has this outpost on e3. Having gone for it, Kasparov activated another resource. That resource was this knight repositioning, and is looking to apply the nastiest of forks by taking on the rim. King a7 coming out of any immediate dangers, led to this avenue of play, and Kasparov is going to try and rip the position right open. Queen c5, probably the only response, got Kasparov to take on the fifth, and rather than capture, which by the way does not appear the right way forwards, Tal selects this bishop move above all others. This bishop move creates plenty of pressure on c3, but given the opposition is Garry Kasparov, what could Kasparov do? If you take this pawn using the queen, not only the bishop is under threat, but this outpost on d7 is wide open. If you go king b6, once the bishop is eliminated, not only the rook is in danger, but there is so much more at stake. This pawn on b5 by no means can be removed, because the king on a1 automatically becomes vulnerable. If you use the queen to remove b5, Once you get rid of this pawn with a check, you would also lock yourself in with a checkmate, and this would not be all the hard to spot. Coming back to the game, this bishop move by Tal was risking everything, but that was Tal, was it not? And the most unexpected move resulted here, and you are not going to believe it. Kasparov does go on to get rid of the pawn, but used the rook to do this. Rook c8, trying everything single piece he had, and it is totally unbelievable how Kasparov, the biggest name at the time, misses or miscalculates this position. If you get rid of the bishop, which is the easiest move in the world not to miss, doesn't this look like game over? And yet, Kasparov, before getting rid of the bishop, chose to deliver this check, and this move in itself was the catalyst of what to unfold. With the king moving forwards, what is wrong with something like this move to c4? Absolutely everything, because once you allow this check to unfold, it would be game over in just 2 moves. King b1, rook e1 check, and after queen c1, this is how you can end it, and what a pity would that have been if you lost in this fashion. Coming back to this position, what is wrong with something like queen a4? If you take, get rid of the queens, and once this bishop departs, can you see any way possible for black to even survive? We didn't think so either, and yet what happened next is totally unbelievable. The great Kasparov came up with this bishop retreat. Tal here sneaks in this timely check, and with the king escaping to the second, look how fast and how accurate Tal appears to be. Any ideas what he tried? With his queen standing in, he could have tried this queen move, but this problem with this move is that is not going to be strong enough, because a mate in one from the corner is easily averted if you move this bishop on b3 away, anywhere, for example to a4 or d5 or even c4. Tal chose a far more spectacular way forwards. Is there anyone who wants to have a go? And here is where we hinted on that spectacular queen sacrifice, and this is the moment of truth. This was the move he applied, sending shockwaves down Kasparov's spine. Kasparov could not believe what was going on. He immediately got rid of the queen. Tal in turn squeezes in this check, and with the bishop now forced to block the check in this way, some major pieces were about to depart. Firstly, Tal could have removed the rook, and if you now redirect the queen to go after the rook, once you take with a check, king b3, and now rook a1, and the position would be very tight. Is this a possible draw? It could look like one. Knight b4, for example, would be a terrific sacrifice, but to what end? If you take the knight, you are not looking at the incoming check, because after the king backs off, removing this bishop is going to lead to this pawn to depart, but after this check appears, king b6, another check, and king c5, and even if you take this pawn, with the king, this appears to be a draw unless someone blunders or gets flagged. Coming back to this position, rather than come in with a queen check from e5, what would this check do? King b7, this check, and king a7, and once you get rid of the bishop, would this position be any different? It's exactly the same. If you take and capture with either the queen or king, we are going to end up with exactly the same line as we looked at. So coming back to the actual game, the last move we saw was this bishop move into a4 to block the check. Tal here took with a check, and it was at this point where Kasparov blunders, and blunders big time. Let's analyze. If you take the rook, once the queen drops, rook c4 appears to be saving both the rook and knight. Rook e2 and knight b8, and should you pursue the knight, jump him here, get the bishop to safety, and once again, this game looks equal in every single way. Kasparov was confident he was going to get there somehow, and decided to play this line differently. He got the king to move up the board. Tal without any delay gets rid of the rook, and now via this queen attack, it appears Kasparov is out of the woods, but in fact if only he could see what was round the corner. Can you work out the ending, because Tal did, and did this in a split of a second. This was the move he opted for. So what happens if the queen gets rid of the bishop here? This is what happens, and is game over instantly. And for this reason, we know why rook e2 was played. So to avoid this from happening, Kasparov first got the knight to jump right into the rim of the board, and the idea is that should the knight fall, not queen takes bishop, because the mate is still going to happen with c4, but this takes right into c5. How on earth do you stop the mate coming from a7 using the queen? It's via this attack on the queen. It stops the mate, but is it a game changer? In with a check, bishop b6, and queen b7, and there is only one move that saves the day. Provided you move the bishop out of danger and keep him at the same time in control of the dark squares across a7, c5, e3, f2 and g1, this game cannot be won or lost. However, was Tal able to work out the consequences of getting rid of the knight? He absolutely did, and this is why the knight was not eliminated just yet. Tal decided to apply this check, and though king a3 does hold you to a dead draw. How? Via this check, and the moves simply repeat, and I just said simply, which is not at all simple when that time is ticking down on your clock with probably seconds remaining. As soon as this rook check materialized, once again, Garry Kasparov went for what he thought would work. He just got rid of the rook, but this was his worst move in the game, because as soon as he committed to getting rid of the rook, Tal had locked in a checkmate in just 2 moves. Once the rook removed this pawn with a check, Kasparov had no choice but to place his king to the rim, and as soon as Tal took with a check, since the king had no legal place to go, Tal at the same time had enforced a checkmate, and what a way to end this game of round 2. Looking at the analysis of this game, Kasparov did play an outstanding game. He gained a comfortable advantage, but even Garry Kasparov was not able to capitalize, and as a result, he ended up losing an otherwise won game. Tal had committed way too many more blunders than Kasparov, but mind you, nothing matters but the end result. In fact, we can provide some more details about how this mini encounter between the two went in Tbilisi. Kasparov had started very badly and lost his first 3 games. He then bounced back, got in the lead, and then Tal somehow did his magic and in the end managed to equalize to keep the score equal. For those who want to know, there had only been 2 draws, and the remaining decisive games were shared equally between them. Does this game stand out? For sure it does, with a Tal spectacular queen sacrifice, which Kasparov, in way, was not able to handle in the end, and actually, like we said earlier, lost an otherwise won game. And this was game 2 of 12. We sincerely hope you enjoyed and look forwards to seeing you again with our next comeback. God bless.